Okay, so I'm going to be talking about climate change in grasslands too at a sort of a much more general level than what Dr. Bai just did. He was getting right into to some of the mechanisms which we need to find out. So this is a lot more general. We've been working on this project called the Prairie Regional Adaptation Collaborative. There were a number of these adaptation collaboratives across the country, and the prairies was one of them, the 3 prairie provinces. And I was involved in the grassland component, so there were 2 parts to this. How vulnerable are our grasslands to climate change? And secondly, what are the options for adapting to climate change, especially among policymakers? So let's just start with climate change itself. All our vulnerability analysis is based on modeling future climates, right? So there are many different climate change scenarios out there. You know, there are many different global climate models, and then there are many different emissions models. And so you combine climate models with emissions models, you get a lot of different combinations. And so the general approach is to look at a bunch of them and try to see the range of variation. And I'm going to show you the results from 2 scenarios, but we've looked at many more. I picked 2 that sort of represent a warmer and a cooler alternative for the prairie region. So first of all, this is potential evapotranspiration, and as I said, I've got 2 models, and so the red represents the warmer of the 2 scenarios, and the blue represents the cooler scenario. Here is where we are now. It's actually the 1961 to 90 baseline, and then going out to the 2080s. The reason there are 3 lines is there's sort of a separate line for each province, prairie ecozone. And so first of all, if we look at potential evaporation, of course, this is the big story of climate change, is this strong warming that's predicted, which will result in a big increase in potential evapotranspiration. Now, here's annual precipitation, and it's a fairly modest change. It turns out the warm scenario shows a little bit of an increase, the cool one shows a bit of a decrease. The point I want to make, though, is that the scale here, the vertical scale, is the same between these 2 graphs. You know, it goes from 300 millimeters to 900 millimeters. So, you know, you sometimes hear this point made that, you know, if we get more precipitation, well, that's good, okay, but this is how much more precipitation. You know, all the models, even the wet ones, are showing sort of a modest change in precipitation, whereas the warming resulting in higher evapotranspiration is a you know, a much bigger change. So I think that's why even with an increase in precipitation, we may have you know, a drier future climate. Another issue that's often brought up is the seasonal distribution of precipitation. Of course, here in the prairies, we have a summer precip kind of regime, right? Our precip is strongly concentrated in the summertime, and so here's the change, and basically the warmer scenario particularly shows a decrease in the proportion of precip in summer. So what it means is you got your total annual precip, more of it, a larger part of it's going to fall in the wintertime, smaller part in the summertime. But again, it's not a huge change. It's from about 65–66% down to maybe 62% of the precip falling in summer. So it's not an enormous change in precip, but in seasonal distribution, but we did try to take that into account. Okay, so what about vegetation response? Well, we know that climate controls the type of vegetation, and believe it or not, I've had lots of arguments with people. They say, well, no, there's all these other factors like land use and stuff, and you know, if there's one thing that we know as ecologists is that the big picture of vegetation is controlled by climate. And if that's not true, you know, I'm quitting and going home because that's okay. I think we know this, you know. So okay, so we developed a model to predict the shift in grassland zonation with climate change. Now, one of the things that we tried to do was, you sometimes see models that are developed from Canadian data, and then you apply that to a warmer future climate, and the problem there is you're pushing the model into a range beyond that which was used to calibrate it. You're extrapolating. So our approach was to take data not just from Canada, but down through the Great Plains states, which already have that warmer climate, which is predicted. So basically the calibration of our models encompasses our present temperatures and also much warmer temperatures. How much warmer? We get to Nebraska. I'm sorry we don't get to Kansas. It's not even the warming predicted for this century for us doesn't quite take us to Kansas. Okay. So what are we modeling? Well, here's our familiar ecoregions of the prairie ecozone in Canada. And so I looked at sort of comparable map for the United States, and it seemed like what I wound up with was the classic 1964 map, potential natural vegetation. It seemed to be the basis of lots of different maps used in the U.S. So the states that we're looking at are Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska. Oh, Kansas is in there. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we've got Kansas. So, and then, combining the Canadian and the American data, we developed a statistical model to predict which of these vegetation zones will occur as a function of climatic variables. Okay? Okay, so here's, this is an output of the model using the current, or the baseline climate. Here's our Canadian prairies, and basically what it does is it reproduces the current pattern of vegetation pretty well, so essentially shows that the model is working. Actually, the palest color here, well, this yellow color here was calibrated on the mixed grassland, this mid-green on the moist mixed grassland, this one on the aspen parkland, and then forest beyond that. So it works pretty well. We're actually getting this US type, generated in the driest climates, but it works pretty well. Now, this is the 2080s. Here's our cooler scenario. First thing you notice is that all that forest around the outside has been pushed out and replaced by aspen parkland. So that kind of the southern edge of the boreal forest, pushed northward, replaced by aspen parkland. Here's our Canadian grassland types up in here. And then this big pale area is that dry mixed grassland type that they map in eastern Montana, eastern Wyoming. So basically it's sort of like saying that drier kind of mixed grassland will tend to replace our current mixed grassland. Over here, this is the type of somewhat moisture mixed grassland that they map in North Dakota, South Dakota, moving up into Manitoba, eastern Saskatchewan. Now, this is the warmer of the two scenarios for the 2080s. Forest is really gone, all replaced by these US vegetation types. Here's again our Montana, Wyoming kind of mixed prairie. And then this buff color down here is the blue grama buffalo grass, the short grass prairie from eastern Colorado. So that's kind of the scale of vegetation change that could happen with that amount of warming, is that short grass type from Colorado finding a climate that's suitable for it here in the Canadian prairies. So under the warmer of the two scenarios, again, we've got a range of possibilities. Now, the one thing I want to emphasize about this, and it's sort of a frequent criticism of this approach in the literature, is that they're called climatic envelope models. In other words, we're sort of describing the climatic envelope of each vegetation type. And so people say, well, you don't know if that's going to happen, right? Because the climate may change, but it may take longer for the vegetation to catch up with it. Different species may migrate at different rates. So, that community from Wyoming or Colorado may not exactly be reproduced here because one species got here sooner than another, and so on. So I don't think we should say this is an exact prediction. What we should say is it points us to trends, right? And so what are the trends? Reduction in tree and shrub cover. I know yesterday I talked about this issue in our parkland where we're losing a lot of our grassland to tree encroachment, but if these trends are at all meaningful, what this implies is that eventually that process should turn around and we should see some of that parkland, gradually losing tree cover, becoming more grassland-like, and similar trends in other places. I sort of believe this in with some of our current evidence. Okay, remember the drought of 2001, 2002? Driving from Saskatoon to Edmonton, how many dead aspen trees you saw in that stretch of country. Aspen dieback there are actually quite a few papers on the topic. You know, I think trees in the parkland really are on the climatic edge. You know, and with more prolonged droughts and so on, we could see more of that dieback. Okay. With respect to grasses, shift in structure, where we have mid-grasses and short grasses, we may have mostly short grasses. Similarly, where we have tall grasses and mid-grasses, we may shift towards mostly mid-grasses, so to shift to the shorter species. And one of the predictions is that where we have cool season or C3 grasses dominant now, we may shift towards more dominance by warm season C4 grasses. And Dr. Bai's results showed there that blue grama, one of the dominant C4s, is well adapted to this warmer and higher CO2 climate apparently. So, yeah. And then finally, with respect to species, there are quite a few species in common between our mixed prairie, say, and that to the south of us. But there are also some additional species that we don't have. And so one of the predictions would be that we'll see some species that we don't have yet gradually making their way northward. For example, big sagebrush. I guess it does technically occur in Alberta, doesn't it? Some tiny population, but very limited. Yeah, it doesn't occur at all in Saskatchewan or Manitoba. But it's pretty common from Montana southward, I think. So, big sagebrush. And there are other species like that. Buffalo grass. It's on the endangered species list in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. It doesn't occur at all in Alberta, I don't think. Yet you get into sort of central Montana southward, it becomes a common species. So, I think changes in species composition are the other prediction. Okay, so that's grassland zonation. What about production? Of course, we all know that moister climates have more productive grasslands. They produce more forage in a year. Therefore, they support higher stocking rates, so they're more productive for livestock production. And so we developed a model to predict that. And again, it's based on this idea of using Canadian data, but also using data down into the Great Plains states that already have this warmer climate. Okay? And without going into the details, these are 6 locations in the prairies from drier to moister climates. And this is the prediction, which basically is a sort of a small decrease in the cooler scenario, and I would say a modest decrease in production under the warmer scenario. One question I guess you could ask is, why isn't it a bigger change? I showed that huge increase in potential evapotranspiration. Why only this sort of moderate change in productivity predicted from the model? And the reason is that, annual precipitation is still by far the most important variable predicting the level of grassland productivity. Even with warmer and cooler climates, just the total amount of precipitation seems to be the variable that contributes most to variation in productivity. So, okay. The other thing right away I have to admit is this kind of model is based strictly on climate variables, doesn't include the carbon fertilization effect, and so we know that higher concentrations of CO2 increase photosynthetic rates, improve water use efficiency. The field experiments in which Dr. Bai showed some examples with CO2 enrichment do show increased grassland productivity, and that's been shown quite a few of these different experiments around the world. And so it would seem that this carbon increase in CO2 should be a good thing for productivity. One of the question marks that's been raised is to do with nutrient uptake and forage quality. I think there are some results showing that forage quality is less with this CO2 enriched production. So
less nitrogen.
Sorry, less nitrogen. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, less nitrogen, so lower protein content. Yeah, yeah. So what that implies is even if you've got a lot more grass there, if it's got poor quality, the cattle have to eat more, and so. So I guess my conclusion, without being going into this too deep, is that the overall effect is uncertain, but this CO2 fertilization effect may help to moderate the effect of the drier climate. So So maybe the decrease in production that I showed before won't be quite as bad as it looked because of this. Maybe it'll even increase for all I know. I don't, do you have a feeling from your observation?
All I can go on is what my colleagues have been telling me. I
Yeah.
talked to Clinton Owensby a lot over there at K-State.
Yeah.
He found that you get low protein. You get
Low
more
protein,
biomass,
yeah.
but lower protein.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yugong, do you have a feeling about this, overall effect? Do you have any? No. It's sort of a couple of different effects.
Yeah, but I think you might be right in terms of the water use efficiency may be enhanced to offset the drought.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess the one point I would want to make about this, though, is that, you know, regardless of whether it's a decrease or it's sort of more of a break-even thing, you know, I have heard a lot of people using the word desertification, you know, in this prediction for the coming century, and you know, there's no sign of that in this at all. You know, I mean, even if we're looking at warmer, drier climates, we're not anywhere close to climatic deserts, you know, in these predictions for the coming century in Saskatchewan. We're looking at Nebraska and Colorado. We're not looking at.
Not too bad. Then.
Yeah, exactly. That's not that bad.
It's warmer.
Yeah, it's warmer. I've heard that. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Now, here's another big factor. I've just been looking at averages, 30-year normals. Okay. The climatologists tell us the other major prediction is increased variability in precipitation, more extreme events. And, you know, on the one hand, we could have more frequent droughts. On the other hand, we could have more frequent 2010s, you know, where we had vastly higher than normal precip. So here's my favorite piece of data where Mike and I were just talking about this. This is, you know, a record of grassland productivity from a research site at Manyberries, Alberta, from the 1930s up to now, basically. Exactly the kind of, you know, long-term data set that's almost impossible to get funding for, right? So, okay, and this is a dry climate, dry mixed prairie. The average production here was only about 425 kilograms per hectare, but we had some years with only 100 kilograms per hectare, and some years with 900 kilograms per hectare. You know, so we're talking about an extremely variable environment. I mean, you know, just imagine going from 100 kilograms to 900 kilograms, you know, from year to year. Of course, this is 1988, I remember that. 1961, I don't really remember, but I know that was another massive drought year. So that's really the important thing, is how many of these years, like those three there, are you going to get? That's what is really going to make a difference to livestock producers and to the environment in general. So this is kind of mixing apples and oranges, but this blue over here is what I just showed you, the historic record year to year. And then these four lines here are climatic scenarios of average climate projected in the future. So I guess what I'm trying to show here is that this stuff here, this wild swings in year-to-year variation, may be more important than this long-term trend in average conditions. In other words, if we get more of these extremes here, that's really what's going to affect people, not this rather moderate change in average conditions. So. Okay, what are the effects of drought? Well, production is kind of the immediate result. In fact, grassland seems to respond almost instantaneously. Like it doesn't take, there's no, you know, year-to-year lag effect. Like if you go back and look at the Manyberries data, single year of dry weather, low production. Get rain next year, high production. You know, it's very fast response. In the long term, though, eventually, you know, a number of years like this, you get changes in vegetation composition. And of course, you know, Rob and I remember Robert Copeland, who was our professor way back when, had some plots that he measured in the 40s and then measured them again in the 50s. And, you know, this whole thing about changes during the drought of the 30s were pretty well studied. You know, so people actually knew what happened in the 30s. And basically what happened was shift from taller grass species to shorter grasses. Here in the northern mixed prairie, one of the biggest changes was a shift to early growing species like sandbergs, bluegrass, June grass, sedges. So the idea here is we had some snow in the winter, right? So some of these early species that can take advantage of that little pulse of snow melt actually did quite well during the 30s. And it's hard to believe, but if you look at the data from the 30s, the amount of sandbergs bluegrass that was out there, like lots of people never even notice it now, you know, I mean, it's there obviously, but you know, it was a pretty important grass in the mixed grassland during the 30s because of this effect. And then, you know, from Barry's work on stocking rates, kind of the idea that it wasn't just the drought, it was also massive overgrazing at that time. And you put the two of them together, that's why the effects were so serious. Another factor that I think we should pay attention to is invasive plants. First of all, we're putting all this stress on our communities, and so they may be more susceptible to invasion because of that. Secondly, there are a number of papers out there that suggest that invasives will have advantages under climate change compared to long-lived native species. Maybe faster evolution in some cases, efficient dispersal. You know, you're thinking about species having to shift their ranges northward. You know, what's good at dispersal? Invasives, right? Part of that is that they can use all those disturbed habitats out there as stepping stones. You know, if you've got something that requires intact grassland, it's got to find those patches of grassland to move through. Whereas for an invasive, there's disturbed habitat everywhere. You know, that's no limitation for them. So for all those reasons, invasion problems, which are already a serious issue in our grasslands, could become an even more serious issue in the future. The one bright light, I guess, is that if we're hammered by drought, that should slow them down a little bit, in the sense that a lot of our invasion problems are worse, you know, in wet years and in wet parts of the prairies, and so I think in drought years we'll probably have less to worry about. Another major issue: wetlands are a huge issue in the prairies. Provide waterfowl habitat, other aquatic diversity. They provide a forage resource, you know, for producers, and we know that our wetlands are directly weather dependent, and we see this on a year-to-year basis. If we have wet years, there are more wetlands out there, and duck populations actually follow. They track along with the weather pretty closely too, and so people have done models predicting the effect of climate change on number of ponds, number of ducks, and of course they show over the long term a trend towards fewer wetlands, or the wetlands that are there becoming the kind of wetlands that dry out more frequently. You know, so one comparison I've seen is they look at that area in southeastern Saskatchewan and southern Manitoba, which has tons of wetlands. It's considered the most productive duck habitat, and changing to the kind of wetlands that we would have in southwestern Saskatchewan, which are sort of dry most of the time and only occasionally full of water. You know, so loss of wetlands could be another big issue. Just a little bit about adaptation, and of course this was the purpose of this Prairie Regional Adaptation Collaborative. So what I did is I kind of read everything I could on what people have talked about in terms of adapting to climate change in grassland management, and a lot of it was just kind of a big blur in my mind. And one thing that helped to simplify it was this idea of short-term, medium, and long-term, and they call this the 3 R's. Resistance is the short-term, resilience is the medium-term, response is the long-term. So in the short-term, think about a drought in a given year. What do producers do to cope with that drought? That's kind of resistance. So it's the things we've heard about: reducing livestock numbers, finding alternative grazing, purchasing feed, and so on. In the medium term, what can producers do to increase their resilience? The idea of resilience is if you've got a resilient system, it can take a disruption like a drought and bounce back from it. That's the idea of resilience. So what helps it to bounce back? One of the things you hear about is increasing the proportion of yearlings, because that makes it easier to buy and sell livestock. any kind of sustainable grazing management should help, right? Because healthier rangeland is probably better able to cope with these climatic fluctuations. Increasing the forage supply by seeding cropland. Increased feed reserves, I think I heard Dwayne talking about that. Improving water storage and distribution systems. Here's a really good idea. I think we should follow up on this one. Community pasture programs. You know, if we brought in community pastures, then the government could help to provide emergency grazing. Why don't we suggest that? Okay, detection and control of invasive species, crop insurance for forage. We talked about that already. Drought monitoring and prediction. We talked about that. Now, the idea of a long-term adaptations is, remember I said resistance, resilience, response, and the idea of this response is, you know, resilience only goes so far. You know, you can bounce back from a drought, but what if over the long term things keep on changing? Sooner or later you have to accept that the system's going to change, and so then it's a case of helping the system to change without too much damage. Right? So, you know, the general ideas of keeping our grasslands healthy through good range management, that's good. Don't reduce our future options. For example, if we lose some of our native prairie, it's not like we can get it back again very easily. So that's reducing our future options. But the big issue with response is that, you know, if we do have these big changes, these big zonation changes, eventually we're going to have some species moving northward. Species we don't have now have got to expand their ranges northward, you know, to provide this new kind of grassland. And if we can facilitate that process, you know, it'll help grasslands to continue functioning even as the climate changes. And there's actually two major approaches that you hear a lot about in discussions about this. One approach is this idea that's familiar to conservation folks is connectivity, right? You've got these patches of fragmented grassland. If you can make connections between them, connections of habitat, that makes it easier for species to move northward. So here's this example from southern Manitoba. Grasslands are very fragmented, but if you were going to conserve prairie, why wouldn't you do it right along here where you got some that kind of links up together? Maybe get some more patches of grassland in here and here. You know, establish some connective routes so that if a species was trying to migrate northward, it would have a series of habitats to migrate through. A lot of our grassland species don't actually migrate very fast, and they're not gonna make the jump across a wheat field. They need grassland to move through, and so that's the idea of connectivity. The other approach that's widely discussed out there is what's called assisted migration. And so some people say, well, all this connectivity sounds good, but it'll never work. You know, there's too much lost already. You know, even if you establish these corridors, it'll take too long for species to migrate through them on their own. So, you know, we got to intervene. We've got to pick up those species and move them northward. You know, and in a sense, if we think about tame species, tame forages or annual crops, we do that all the time. It's quite normal to find a seed source from somewhere else and bring it in. So that's kind of the concept is, some of these native species, we will actually go out there and help them. And there's huge debates between those two approaches in the literature. You know, some people say, we're bringing in these species that we don't have, introducing exotics. You know, we've had a century of nightmares from introducing exotics. You know, and are we going to play God by introducing the next thing that we don't have? And other people say, well, really those big exotic problems were the things from Eurasia that we brought in. And if we're talking about something that's in Montana and we're going to move it to Saskatchewan, that's probably safer than bringing in something from Siberia. And so this kind of debate is pretty actively working its way out in the literature. Okay, thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much for your less radiation. I'm having a question. Well, how do you get the precipitation data and temperature in the future?
Sorry?
I mean,
Oh, where do I get the numbers from?
how do you get the climate data in the future?
Oh, yeah. Well, so there are all these, there are many different organizations running these global climate models, and actually the government of Canada has a program where they assemble all the results from them. It's at the University of Victoria, and it's, what's it called? CICS, Climate Impacts and, sorry, I can't remember the exact address, but if you talk to me afterwards, I can tell you how to find it. It's at the University of Victoria, it's funded by the government of Canada, and they've just got all this stuff assembled, many different models, free, you just have to sign on, you can get it for free and so on. So maybe talk to me afterwards. Yeah. Anne?
Did the degree change, number of degrees changes for your higher and your lower temperature scenarios?
I haven't really looked at it that way. I've always made the jump to growing degree days, which I think are more meaningful, and so, and what I showed you was potentially evapotranspiration, but I think in terms of growing degree days, it's on the order of, like right now, here in Saskatoon, we're at about 1,600, I think, growing degree days. And I think the warmer scenario would probably be up around 2,500 growing degree days, so something of that scale.